This episode of Therapist Connect podcast is sponsored by WebHealer, the #1 website provider for private practice therapists. Serving the community for 20 years, WebHealer offers a non-technical and fully supported online platform helping therapists use the internet to grow their practice. Whether you need a website, a booking system, or even a secure email address for your practice, WebHealer can help. Contact WebHealer today via www.webhealer.net and use the coupon Therapist Connect for £100 off their Do It For Me service.
Welcome to the Therapist Connect podcast, a podcast for therapists by therapists.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Therapist Connect podcast. My name is Dr. Peter Blundell, and today I'm back interviewing therapists about their life and work in the counselling and psychotherapy community. Today, I'm delighted to be interviewing Bronagh Starrs. Bronagh is creator and programme director of the MSc in Adolescent Psychotherapy that's at Dublin Counselling and Therapy Centre, which is completed in partnership with the University of Northampton. Bronagh is also director of Blackford Adolescent Gestalt Institute and maintains a private practice in Omagh, Northern Ireland as an adolescent psychotherapist. Hi, Bronagh.
Hi, Peter. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. Good.
It's lovely to finally meet you after all this time.
You too, Peter. You too, yeah.
Bronagh, thank you very much for coming on to the Therapist Connect podcast. It's really lovely to have you here. And I know we've chatted quite a bit on Twitter, so it's nice to actually kind of chat in person. We're going to have like a set of questions today that I kind of ask everybody, and then some specific questions to you. But my first question is which is one that I ask absolutely everybody who comes on the podcast, is can you tell us a little bit about how you became to be a therapist in the first place? What kind of drew you to us as a profession?
Sure. And just first of all to say that it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you today, Peter. In relation to becoming a therapist, I suppose looking back, I always had a searching heart. And when I graduated from college, about 23 years of age, really then I started a journey of personal development and discovery. And then psychotherapy training felt like a natural evolution, I guess. And I'd been a music teacher and I'd loved working with young people. But I was more interested in what made them tick rather than, teaching them the F-sharp minor scale on the piano. And I knew I didn't want to teach music for the rest of my life. So I just turned 30 a few days before my psychotherapy training started. And I remember sitting there with a palpable sense of excitement and thinking to myself, this is what I want to be when I grow up. And I suppose that passion has never left. That's the kind of, it came from a very personal place. And
that's lovely. I love the phrase "a searching heart." I think that's that's a really, really nice phrase. So it's interesting then that you. It sounds like you were interested in working with adolescents kind of immediately. That was the
right.
kind of group of people that you were drawn to as a therapist.
Mm-hmm. I'd say that probably came from my own adolescence. Was quite a colourful, difficult time, as it is for lots of people, and in my own personal therapy before I trained as a psychotherapist, I spent many an hour with a therapist focusing and exploring in my own adolescence. So I suppose, I had a fascination for what happens and the complexity of adolescence. And then I was teaching music and was working with choirs. So after graduation, I just, all my contact was with young people. So I suppose it was that natural evolution although the psychotherapy training that I did was an adult-oriented training. Yeah.
I mean, that's quite common actually, isn't it? That people do the adult training and then possibly go on to work with young people or children sometimes. So could you tell us a little bit more about your career since then and how has that evolved?
Yeah, well, actually, just from that point, Peter, so I did a great psychotherapy training in Dublin, and I'm from Northern Ireland actually, but I travelled down there to do the psychotherapy training, and then in our final couple of years we did placement work, and of course I wanted to work with adolescents, And I was very aware that I had zero training. And I remember thinking, does nobody think this is a bit nuts that I'm actually working with teenagers, but I have no training? But, everybody seemed to be fine with it. And it was quite funny because, I'd have one session and I would think, oh my God, that was amazing. I wish somebody nearly recorded that. It was a beautiful session. I think I'm going to be a great therapist. And then the next session was like, there's just carnage after the first 2 minutes. Oh my God, this person's never going to come back. This is really terrible. And, I was a real seat of my pants practitioner. And I didn't know why one session was good and one session wasn't good. And of course, I would blame the young person. Well, they just weren't ready. And now I would look at it and say, I didn't have the contact skills to engage that young person. But I suppose I'm someone who likes to know what I'm doing. So I set about trying to find a training. And I suppose play therapy didn't really excite me. And it just wasn't something that I wanted to go down that route. So I was looking for training and I found one in the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland in Ohio. And it was 2 5-day training workshops. And actually, quite a lot of it was around children and some of it was around adolescents, but it was great, loved it. It was very American. And then I came home to Northern Ireland and I thought, that's it. That's as much of a training as there is. I think that was like 2004, 2005. So I thought, all I have is me and the teenagers, and I'm going to just sit and pay really, really close attention. So I have 2 boxfuls of journals, Peter, of writing down, what happened and when I intervened, what happened next. And when he said this, why did I say that? And I just started to be very meticulous in, I suppose, exploring and analysing the therapeutic space. And then I guess I seemed to be good at it. I seemed to get the clients, and then people invited me to come and talk for a half hour or to train for an hour, or invite me back for a half day or then a day and then a couple of days. And so I was kind of doing more training by invitation. And I always was left with a sense that, gosh, I feel like I have more to say. And I was deepening my work with adolescents all the time. So I decided, I think around 2011, I decided that I was going to write up a 6-week program because people were always asking for more training. And I sat down and started to write it. And as I thought, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a year. And then the more I wrote, the more I thought, oh my God, this is actually a 2-year program. So I ended up with this 2-year program. Which in 2012, I then delivered for the first time. It was a diploma in adolescent psychotherapy in Dundalk in Ireland. And a few years ago, it became a master's in adolescent psychotherapy. So I partnered with Dublin Counselling Therapy Centre, who are in partnership with the University of Northampton. And as far as I know, it's the first and only master's in adolescent psychotherapy in the world. It's 2 years wholly devoted to adolescent psychotherapy. So now in terms of my career, I see adolescent clients. I used to work with adults and children, but I just don't have the time anymore. But I work with adolescents and I teach the master's program. And I also do a lot of training and workshops for therapists and other professionals who work with adolescents. And I also do a lot of work with parents, webinars and talks and whatever. So yeah, there's a nice mix of the client work and the teaching, which I love.
That's fantastic. Gosh, there's so much in there that I kind of want to know more about. I was really resonating with when you were talking about being an early, like kind of newly qualified kind of practitioner and kind of the ups and downs with that and kind of trying to find your way with it and how you make sense of it if there's nothing out there to kind of connect with or people to support you with all of that. It sounds quite a challenging experience, I think.
Yeah, it was quite lonely, I think, at the start, Peter. And I had a sense that the way that I was working with adolescents was very different than the way a lot of other people were working with them. And I couldn't quite find the words for it. I have over over the years. But I felt like I was just burrowing away here quietly with these teenagers, but there was something really important happening there as well.
I think that sounds lovely, and I'd be absolutely fascinated to read all those journals that you've written. It's interesting that you did that, because I think these days we probably call that like deliberate practice, where you're kind of really consciously going through the work that you've done and the areas that you might need to improve or change. But it sounds like you just kind of did that intuitively as a way of like developing yourself.
I did, and I suppose I saw the journaling as really trying to understand developmentally what was happening with these teenagers, and therapeutically what was happening, what worked and what didn't. And I have come up with this approach to working with adolescents, which is very focused on, I suppose adolescents have taught me. It's not, my model, this is what worked, or this is what I've come up with, but it's actually just paying attention to teenagers and going, this is what seems to resonate with them, and then tell you when it doesn't. So it's a very ground up model that I have put together.
It sounds like, particularly because it's come from that practitioner experience, but listening to the young people, and kind of what they found meaningful. I was quite shocked to hear that you're the only masters in the world that is centered around adolescence. But then when I thought about it, I thought, actually, I haven't heard of any others actually. So that's quite an achievement, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of child and adolescent trainings around, but they seem to, and I certainly can't talk for all of them, but there seems to be quite an emphasis on the child, and the adolescent is maybe to a lesser degree. I know I certainly would have people participate in workshops all the time who have completed child and adolescent trainings, and they say, this is the part that was missing, or there wasn't enough of this, or so I suppose I wanted to have the training to be solely about adolescent psychotherapy.
I think that's brilliant, and obviously a space where people can go to kind of specialise. I suppose one of the things I was thinking about, I suppose if people do child and adolescent training, they feel like the adolescent bit's missing, but if people do adult training, maybe working from 16 plus, it's almost like assumed that the 16 plus is kind of similar to adults, and that might not necessarily be the case.
That drives me nuts, Peter, actually. I think what happens in the world of counselling and psychotherapy is we think civically 18 years of age is an adult, and 18 in terms of confidentiality parameters and how we work with people, that's adult work. But I would defy you to find a 22-year-old who has a fully functioning adult ego. And even, the adolescent brain development, the neuroscience would say that, adolescents start during kind of 11, 12 years of age. And that whole myelination process, the end of adolescence really in a non-traumatized brain is around 24 years of age. So I think we have the big challenge is to think more developmentally. I would work with, and the reason I don't call them teenagers, I call them adolescents, is because I would work with people in their early 20s, and I would very much see them as adolescents, and I would involve their parents. If you have a 23-year-old and mum phones up, "Hi, Bronagh, we're looking for an appointment for our son," and that she's also going to pay for the therapy. I'm thinking that's not an adult, and there's probably issues tangled up with the parents there as well. So and people think that's a little bit strange at the start, that you would work with people over 18 in a very adolescent way, but when you think developmentally, it makes perfect sense.
But I suppose there's something in there where you're talking about depending on who the client is, and their situation and how involved their family is with all of that.
Exactly. Yeah, I would say that people say, do you work with people in their 20s with their parents as well? I say, well, I would never ever involve parents with an adult client, but a lot of the 20-somethings that I work with aren't adults. So, and it works. There's a real gift in that, because there is quite a lot of untangling from parents, and all that work needs to happen before that emergence of the self can take place. And you fast track a lot of that work when you involve the parents, actually.
Really interesting. So you have got this approach that you work with. How would you define that approach? Kind of, have you got a name for it, or how would you describe it?
Well, I mean, the title of my book is A Radical Relational Approach, I guess. So I'd say relational, phenomenological, existential. I hold the adolescents' phenomenological experience at the heart of the work, how they construct their life space experience. And I suppose I would see my role as supporting them to make meaning of their experience. I'm thinking developmentally all the time. How do I support this adolescent to develop a greater capacity for self-reflection, to develop more ownership of their experience, and to develop a stronger sense of self and of personal integrity? Developmental work involves parents, so I always involve the parents. And also in terms of therapeutic approach, I've come to realize that adolescents, especially those who've endured trauma, have a really hard time integrating verbal intervention. So I've come up with a specific way within this methodology of work, and which makes their life space visual and tangible and three-dimensional, which I call sand space. It's a dynamic and very different way of working in the sand to traditional techniques like, play therapy and Jungian approaches. And it seems to work. They integrate and it's transformative. It's also really excellent for supporting the self-reflective capacity and for the emergent voice. Like I would teach a lot of workshops, and this one is undoubtedly the most popular. So, and I'm delighted that so many people have integrated this intervention into their work. But it's really paying attention to not the symptoms, not the self-harm or the eating disorder or the school refusal or whatever these things are, but to see that human being beneath it, and to ask myself the question, not how to cure the symptom, but what's happening developmentally, and how do I situate myself to support this young person to really emerge more with integrity in their life space.
And there's quite a few different examples in the book, isn't there, of ways of doing that, which were really nice to read, and kind of brought some of that alive. When did you get the inspiration to write the book? Have you had that for a while, or did it come about more recently?
Well, I guess I had been asked by so many people, including my students, probably top of the list, to write a book about this relational methodology. And I guess it was a bit like writing the master's program up. I felt that it's something valuable to say. And I think really by far the richest part of the book are the client stories. And I wanted to give voice to their experience. The young people that I've worked with over the years are just amazing, and I have enormous fondness for them and respect for them. And I've learned so much from them. And I knew that readers of the book would learn so much from their stories and from how I engaged with these people as a human being first, and really to support their integrity. And actually my thinking and interventions have continued to develop. So I have another few books in the pipeline as well, if I ever find the time to write them. But yeah, I think it was more demands from people to write a book. Yeah.
Well, the need is there, isn't there? As you say, is that it's maybe a group that is maybe not discussed enough, and the focus and attention hasn't been on them. So having an opportunity to write some of that work up, I think, is really important. I really like the way that so there's kind of like an overview at the beginning, but then you break it down into specific kind of topics and areas throughout the book. So there's lots of different chapters in there around different potential problems or issues that a client might bring.
Yeah. And it's essentially was written as a kind of a broad handbook for the master's program. So all of those chapters are kind of parts of modules on the training program as well. But yeah, I suppose I wrote it with very much speaking to the psychotherapist. Like, how do you cultivate your posture as an adolescent therapist, and how do you understand what's unfolding within the room, within the therapeutic space, and the symptoms, and because the relationship is really important, but we do need interventions as well. So there's that balance between relationship and intervention, and it's a really fine line with adolescents. So I suppose my aim was to really open the heart of the reader to deepen their encounter with adolescence, really.
I think the book does that really well, actually, and it was really nice to read, and I got quite a lot out of it, actually, I really loved it. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll ask you some broader questions about the therapy community in a minute, but just before that, I was wondering, are you able to give us like a hint or an idea of any of the other books that you are possibly writing, or is that top secret at the moment?
Not at all. So I'm writing a book about sand space, about that actual intervention, and I'm also writing a book about anxiety in the modern world, because anxiety has just escalated amazingly, and my understanding of anxiety 10 years ago was very different than it is now, and the kids coming in are very different than they were 10 years ago, and the parents. And so that whole process of making meaning of the anxiety and how to work and support the teenager with the parents and work in that wider interdisciplinary domain with it. Because I suppose there's just such a desperate need around anxiety. And again, with anxiety, we throw mindfulness techniques at it, but that's just symptom management. There is so much more to anxiety. And I suppose for a lot of therapists, once you do the mindfulness meditations, the breathing techniques, you're kind of out of it. I know, I would supervise people who would say, so they come in with anxiety, and I said, so let's do some mindfulness breathing. And they said, well, I already did that with another therapist. And they're like, I didn't know what else to do, so anxiety is something that we really need to get our heads around. And I do a lot of anxiety clinics for parents and practitioners around, and they are always so well attended because people are just desperate to understand it. People are so bewildered.
I mean, offering that kind of mindfulness or technique can be a bit of a shutting down of exploration, can't it? As you're giving somebody something to do rather than kind of exploring the feelings kind of that's going on for that particular person.
Exactly. And I suppose with a developmental lens, I'm always interested in how anxiety shows up in the life space and how, people's relationship to anxiety. And people come in the door with so much urgency. We just want this anxiety taken away. We want them to stop in panic attacks and get them back to school really, really quickly. And then I will pick up the urgency as a therapist and go, oh my God, right, what techniques do I have to help these panic attacks go away and to get a phased return back into school? And we miss that whole human being underneath all of that.
And even when you were talking, then I was feeling anxious, thinking about the rush of we've got to get this sorted quickly and the determination behind that. Exactly. And actually some of that therapy work is slowing it down, isn't it? And going, hold on, let's actually figure out what's going on.
For sure. Yeah.
I was also really interested in, you mentioned kind of anxiety and how you've noticed it change, through over the years, and how maybe adolescents or kind of parents are kind of coming with a different sense of anxiety. Would you be able to say a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I could say a little bit. I mean, if we had 2 weeks, that'd be great. But
plus, we need to buy your book if we want the full details.
Exactly, Peter. Exactly like that. So I suppose if I talk 7 or 8 years ago and a young person came into my office and anxiety was the issue, I would be thinking, maybe questions in my mind around what's not happening that needs to happen, or or is there family process at play here? But again, there was a meaning for the anxiety in their lives, which wasn't that difficult to figure out. But they're all coming in with the same identical kind of symptoms now, and the parents are coming in with the identical response to it, and it's epidemic levels nearly at the minute. And I've kind of ideas about why that may be happening. I think we've had these holding frameworks in adolescents' lives for years. For example, if I take I grew up as a teenager in the 80s. So family was one of the holding frameworks. And, parents, I came up in a good Catholic Irish family, and, my mother and father stayed together, whether they should have or not. And that's what you do in that family. And school, you went to school as a student, and that's just who you were, and not a full human being, but a student. The church, in terms of our moral code, the Catholic Church would have told you how to conduct yourself. Whether you did or not as a teenager was a different story, but you could push against that kind of moral rule that was laid down. Sexual orientation, I wouldn't have called myself straight as a teenager, because that would have said, that there was difference. There was people who weren't straight because there weren't people who weren't straight. That's just, there was no such thing as anything other than I'm a girl, I fancy boys, end of story. Because there was no other, there was these rigid holding frameworks in place for people. So I think, and our parents related to us, and the adult world in general related to us in this way, that in a very repressed way. So we had a repressive experience of adolescence, and that has all been dismantled over the years, and we're the better for it. And there's a lot more sense of safety and happiness, and and personal integrity and freedom and voice, and that's wonderful. And in the process of that, adolescents now have an expressive experience of adolescence, and their parents are parenting in an expressive era. So, if I had a sore tummy as a teenager and said to my mum, "Oh, Mum, I'm feeling a bit anxious. I don't think I can go to school today." First of all, I wouldn't have the words to say that. But she would have said, "Get on, or I'll give you something to cry about." And it might have had the wooden spoon out or something. And whereas today, the parent, like, "Oh God, are you okay? Do you need to talk to me about stuff? And let me go in and I'll talk to the school. And my goodness, we need to bring you to the GP." And so kids are able to name what's happening. The parents can name it, and we express who we are in a much freer way. And I think by nature that creates anxiety. And I think people's identity in adolescence is much more fluid now. I'm not talking gender, I'm all identity. There's a lot of a vaguer sense of identity. Whereas for me, as a teenager in the 80s, I was a girl, I was a Catholic, and all those connotations. And I lived in a very heteronormative world. And when I went to school, like I would have been very rebellious as a teenager. When I went to school, I was just seen as somebody with bad behavior who needed manners put on them. And my parents would have saw themselves as disciplining me and making sure that I did my homework. But in terms of that deep relational contact, it wasn't there because it wasn't in the culture. And as an adolescent, I didn't really have a voice. So I think we have transitioned massively from repressed adolescence to expressive adolescence. And anxiety, I think, is the fallout of it. That's the nutshell.
I think that's really, really interesting, and it fits in with something that I've thought about, which is there feels like a general awakening around mental health and all of that kind of things. There's a much more awareness around the need to empathize with people and understand people. But as that awareness has got greater, sometimes I wonder whether we actually have the support systems and the stuff to deal with it. So a little bit like what you were talking about there is, as we start to talk about it, we become more aware about it. But actually, have we actually got the spaces to actually explore that kind of properly and be able to manage it?
Well, that's just fascinating, Peter, because my sense is very definitely no. The frameworks that we held in place were, family and school and church and all of these really repressive frameworks. And we don't have like modern frameworks to support these kids. We really don't. We're in flux around that. And it's teenagers are really struggling. And what are we doing? We're pathologizing them. That's what we do. Like, there's a problem somewhere. So let's pathologize these kids because they're all presenting with these symptoms at the minute, which is a bit sad.
A very challenging thing when there's so much pathologization going on, and then with that comes then, these are the types of services we need. But actually, what you're talking about there is actually what are the support systems, the frameworks, the broader things that we can think about that can help people or young adolescents manage those experiences in a better and more supported way.
Exactly. And I think, one of the keys there is I will do a lot of work with parents. I'll do a lot of work with schools, is trying to support the supporting adults to really shift their ground quite a bit, so that we can, because kids will flourish once you do that. Otherwise, we just say, he's anxious and needs self-harm and he needs therapy, or he needs to go to CAMS, or he needs some medication.
Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting. I can't wait to read the book. Your next one. So, thinking a little bit more about the wider therapy community. I suppose we touched on that a little bit almost there. I wondered, how do you see the wider therapy community, and how connected do you feel with other kind of therapists?
Well, that's interesting. I live and practice in Northern Ireland, yet I feel more connected to the south of Ireland. That's where I trained myself. That's where I offer a lot of training workshops and the masters, and where I'm very well known in the world of psychotherapy. I have a much quieter presence in Northern Ireland and the UK, but that's all about to change, actually. I suppose it's something I've been thinking about. I suppose I had a lonely experience in Northern Ireland growing up here as a therapist for the last 20 years. And Northern Ireland has disproportionately high levels of mental ill health in comparison to the rest of the United Kingdom. There's a 25% higher overall prevalence of mental health issues actually here than in England. And as a society emerging and transitioning from conflict, failure to address the mental health legacy of the Troubles has meant that transgenerational trauma is embedded within families and communities. For example, more people have died by suicide in the past 17 years than were killed during 30 years of conflict. And young people in Northern Ireland are more than twice as likely to take their own lives compared with England. So we have a dire need here. And of course, the crisis has been accentuated by high levels of social determinants of, mental ill health, poverty, generational long-term unemployment, poor housing, domestic violence, economic inactivity. And consequently, Northern Ireland possesses one of the highest incidence rates of trauma disorder in the world. So given the lack of investment in mental health, people experience considerable difficulty accessing services. In addition, and there's lengthy waiting times, and there's inadequate therapeutic resources here. It would be well known. So there's an urgent need for accessible, high quality mental health services to meet these complex issues. So the Dublin Counselling Therapy Centre, where I teach the master's programs, in partnership with the University of Northampton, are extending our recruitment to Northern Ireland now and offering master's level professional qualifications in counselling psychotherapy and adolescent psychotherapy. And it's actually going to be taking place in my hometown of Omagh in County Tyrone, which is kind of located around the centre of Northern Ireland, and I will be director of the Omagh campus. So I'm quite excited in terms of establishing a network of depth psychotherapists working here in the north of, which is, it's huge need here. I know when I would have worked with adults, I always described it as it was like lancing the boil. They would come in, and when I wouldn't relate to them in terms of techniques, but really meet and have that deep encounter of another human being, it just allowed them to sit really deeply into themselves. And then all of this terrible stuff came out. And I think you need to be trained at depth in order to be able to hold that space for very wounded people or who are carrying a lot of transgenerational stuff. So in terms of the wider therapy community in Northern Ireland, I have high hopes. I would be really well socially located, like centrally socially located, probably in the whole of Ireland. But not wider. It's kind of interesting. I'm well known here, and then outside of here, not so much at all.
That sounds really exciting. And so when will the first kind of cohort start? Will that be September, or is it going to be?
This October.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Gosh, that's going to keep you busy. Will you still teach in Ireland, in Dublin as well?
I will. It's only 2 hours up the road or down the road, so it's grand. Yeah.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. And then what do you think is the biggest challenge that the profession faces right now? That's a very broad question.
Interesting. Well, actually, I might answer that in relation to adolescent psychotherapy in particular, actually, since we've kind of been focusing on that, Peter. So how I understand it is, let's see if so there are 3 principal categories of referral as adolescents. So there are, I call them direct issues. So the adolescent is or isn't doing something or feeling something or thinking something that's troubling them or troubling other people. For example, anxiety or depression or substance misuse or low academic motivation or aggression. So then there are indirect issues. So the adolescent's environment is creating complexity and strife for them. For example, separation, trauma, grief, adoption, peer isolation. Or there are overt developmental issues where, the parents will phone up and it'll be like, his attitude and his lack of respect for his parents, and he's treating his house like a hotel and battling with parental control. That's the problem. So it's almost always one of those, a direct issue, an indirect issue, or an overt developmental issue. And I suppose talking to and supervising a lot of adolescent psychotherapists, I would say that therapists come under tremendous pressure to intervene at the behaviour level. I think we mentioned that earlier on. So this kid is self-harming and not attending school. And you're a really good therapist if you can get them back to school really quickly and get them to stop self-harming. So there's a lot of pressure from parents, from schools, from the wider interprofessional domain. And the assumption can often be, well, you're the therapist, you fix them. And I think consequently, the work with adolescents is often experienced as a set of techniques to be applied to a struggling teenager. The biggest challenge, I think, facing adolescent psychotherapy is to remain committed to seeing that emerging human being beyond the behaviour and to sit deeply into and trust the healing relationship. We all heal through relationships, adolescents included. And I always know, if I'm doing a training workshop, I always know it's gone successfully, because you do that go around at the beginning and you'll hear the word upskill a lot. I'm here to upskill and just to get more interventions from a tool bag. And people come to an adolescent therapy workshop very often for techniques. But when I do the final closing round, I'll hopefully hear the difference, which is, gosh, I'm more aware of the complexity of this and really how important the therapeutic relationship is. And I go, yay, success. Because we are really driven at the behaviour level, and not with children and not with adults. If I was working with a child and I had a room full of lovely creative things and the kid comes in, the whole thing is like, just track that child, be with the child. And the same with an adult, depend on your methodology, but you just sit with an adult and just allow their process to unfold and just bear witness to them. But with adolescents, worksheets and techniques and breathing, and it's like we interface with their symptoms. And I think that is a huge challenge, is to really commit to that human-to-human encounter, because that's where the healing and the developmental progress happens, I'm convinced.
I was really, when you were talking then, I was really thinking about all the techniques and the strategies and all of that kind of thing, and interacting at the behaviour level, just completely missing the person underneath all of that, and I think there's a risk of doing that in all different types of therapy, but it sounds like it's particularly important for working with adolescents as well.
The way, I know we're on audio here, but I have a little triangle that I often draw out, that the bottom of the big thick part of the triangle is contact, and then the next little bit is strategy, and the top, the tiny little bit at the top of the triangle is technique. And the main piece is how am I making contact with this adolescent? What's happening in this therapeutic contact? What's happening developmentally? The strategic place, I mean, thinking strategically equates with thinking developmentally. So developmentally, what's trying to happen? And then the last little bit is, right, pull something out of your bag of tricks, or do the sound space. But that the techniques really need to be integrated into a depth therapeutic relationship. And I suppose I just know, and I supervise so many people who have fantastic techniques, and I have probably come up with thousands of techniques at this stage. But the issue with them is they're premature. So I have applied this technique to you and it has fallen flat on its face because there is not enough therapeutic ground between us. And I just see that happening over and over and over again. And I say, there are two big transferences in adolescent psychotherapy, and one of them is urgency and the other is despair. And when you're motivated by either of them, you're remote in the contact. And there's a lot of urgency around, we're bringing our kid to see you because he's suicidal ideation, he's self-harming, and this is life or death. You better deliver the goods really quickly. And you don't get the same level of urgency or intensity with kids or with I think it really heightened with teenagers, actually.
It's really interesting. It's making me think about when you talked about if you use those techniques and then that's all you have, there's nowhere to go. Whereas if you've built up a deeper therapeutic relationship, there's always other places that you can go.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, it seems so radical. I think that's part of the, the title of the book. It's radical to really emphasize a therapeutic relationship. And as you said earlier on, to slow people down. And my experience of adolescents is they're hungry for adult contact, like really safe adult contact, because a lot of them don't talk to their parents because their parents don't understand them. And of course, that's not always true, but, that they have that sense. And also it's really useful for them to talk to someone outside their family so that they can kind of develop a relationship to the relationships that they have, which is a huge piece of their developmental work. And it's their, adolescents are meaning makers par excellence. That I always think, even as an adult client, we do a lot of inner child work. And I think we miss the point so much because children have a felt sense, but it's in adolescence that we start making meaning of our experience, giving voice to it. That's where shame becomes really embedded. And actually, if we did more inner adolescent work, we would dislodge and neutralize a lot more shame. And it's also interesting. I would know people who've been in therapy for years and they've done a lot of work in their childhood and they have done an awful lot of work on their present adult experience. But adolescence is a blind spot for us. It really, unless something happened, so my parents separated or someone died or I was sexually traumatized during adolescence, that situation, I may talk about that. But in terms of my developmental journey and the experience of being an adolescent, it's really very underdeveloped. And it's something that really surprises my students because there's a very strong experiential component and they have a requirement to be in personal therapy. And the power of that adolescent process coming back up is absolutely huge and incredibly healing. And I have come to say, and I always say this at the start of every academic year, I've come to see that my students are completing this 2-year master's program. Secondly, to be able to work at this level with adolescents, but primarily to heal themselves and to fall in love with their adolescent self, because that seems to be what happens for them.
Well, I feel like that is a lovely note to kind of finish on, actually. And I feel like I've learned quite a lot speaking to you, and it's been really, really lovely to hear your passion around this subject area. So thank you so much, Bronagh, for coming on and talking to me today.
It has been a pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much for the invitation. My favourite thing in the world is talking about adolescence.
Well, your book, Adolescent Psychotherapy, A Radical Relational Approach, is out now, and you can get it at all good bookshops. So I'd ask everyone to go out and buy a copy while you can. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for listening to the Therapist Connect podcast. Go to www.therapist-connect.com for more discussions and debates.
This episode of Therapist Connect podcast is sponsored by WebHealer, the #1 website provider for private practice therapists. Serving the community for 20 years, WebHealer offers a non-technical and fully supported online platform helping therapists use the internet to grow their practice. Whether you need a website, a booking system, or even a secure email address for your practice, WebHealer can help. Contact WebHealer today via www.webhealer.net and use the coupon Therapist Connect for £100 off their Do It For Me service.